is Mark Farlow, and I have the privilege of addressing you all here for today. This talk is the first of the Architecture series lectures. Before I continue, though, please silence your mobile devices. Thank you for that. Again, I'm Mark. You are seeing me here today because we have a friend of the College of Architecture and Design speaking. Before I introduce you to Mr. Karp, I'd like to say that at the college we believe that the future of design is multidisciplinary, and we host a range of design degrees that include graphic design, this is the commercial, industrial and transportation design, game design, interiors, and architecture. We track design future trends, emerging technologies, and advancements in practice as a means of crafting education approaches in all of these areas. Our Design by Technology lecture series, which is what we are joined together today for, allows us to engage in design discussions and offer broad perspectives of where we're headed. A little bit of housekeeping items that y'all need to know more about. First, the College of Architecture and Design is presenting a mass timber symposium on September 19 and 20 in our Detroit Month of Design location at 1001 Woodward in downtown Detroit. The exhibition there is amazing, and the Mass Timber Conference should be very exciting, especially for our upper level students. Two, on Thursday, September 26th, our Design by Technology lecture series continues with Michael Sorensen, director and partner at Henning Larsen, who will speak on designing beyond boundaries. Henning Larsen is one of the most important architecture firms in the world right now, and that Mr. Sorensen is here in Detroit promises to be very exciting. I encourage all of us to go see that talk. And to do that, you all simply need to register for both events by going to our LTU COAD events page and clicking on lectures. Today, Gary Karp will lecture on ideas on architecture, suburbs, and disability. At the end of the lecture, if we have time, we will take questions and answers, and I'll facilitate that. Gary Karp arrived at Lawrence Technological University School of Architecture when it was called Lawrence Institute of Technology. This was back in the winter of 1973, only months after his back was injured in a spinal cord injury after having fallen from a tree. He had a unique impact on our AIAS group as a campus leader. He rose to the level of president and the national board member of the American Institute of Architects student chapter. And this is how I know Gary, because Gary and I were classmates here at Lawrence Tech back in the 1970s. That's kind of the BC era, ladies and gentlemen. That would be the before computers. There we go. There we go. After working in 2 architecture urban planning firms, he followed an 11-year career in graphic design as a computer graphics production artist of 35mm presentation graphics, and a production manager and then department manager in the San Francisco area, where he moved from Detroit back in 1984. After having established one of the first desktop presentation services groups, he left computer graphics due to chronic strain injuries back in 1992 and began a solo ergonomics consulting practice. In the mid-1990s, offered a book contract, he began writing about disability, ultimately publishing 4 books, numerous journalistic articles and profiles, and traveled worldwide as a disability awareness speaker and trainer at rehab settings, universities, and for corporate and government clients. In 2007, the National Spinal Cord Injury Association inducted him into their Hall of Fame as a disability educator. In addition to his disability work, he currently works as a reservist for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and is a consultant on emergency planning and for people with disabilities and access and functional needs. While Mr. Karp did not pursue a career in architecture in a traditional sense, his career is influenced by his design thinking skills, which he learned here at Lawrence Tech. Today, Gary will present his call for a reset of the urban-suburban condition. Please welcome Gary Karp.
Wow, you gave away most of the talk. Thanks everybody for being here. It's actually really amazing that I'm back here. Kind of surreal, 44 years later, that I get to come back here. So I have a lot to say. As if I have to tell you, have your cell phones ready. There might be a couple of images you want to grab, but let me jump into it. This is my mom and dad, Sam and Betty Karp. Married after the end of World War II, after 6 dates. In 1945, 2 million service people came back from the wars. My dad was a naval officer in the Pacific. He commanded troop carriers. He took soldiers in under fire. And so the women were all waiting for the men to come home. The men were all waiting to get the payoff for having risked their lives for freedom. And they came back, they hooked up, they just wanted to get married and start having babies. And my parents didn't waste any time. A little after 9 months, my brother Bruce was born. 3 years later, my brother Ken. I came 5 years later in 1955. Here we are a little older. I am standing on a box. Where are these people going to live? There wasn't room in the cities for all these new families. And there was this idea of, oh, let's go out into the countryside. It was the American dream to start a family, have a home, buy a car. That's what everybody did. And the home building industry, the road building industry, the auto industry, the banks, they were more than happy to push this idea of the American dream. So we got suburban sprawl. This was Levittown, one of the first suburbs built, where they did a maze of streets and threw up single-family homes. This is in Long Island, New York, and it just continued on from there. My dad was a pharmacist. He had already graduated before the war, so he came back, he opened up a drugstore. This is on 6 Mile Road between Southfield and Greenfield, which at the time was a blue-collar, working-class neighborhood. Our whole family worked in the store. I started behind the cash register when I was 8 years old, and I loved that I got to know those people because, you know, it was a different lifestyle that they lived from what our lifestyle was. And it was so wonderful to see how my dad was such a figure in the neighborhood. He'd been there for over 20 years. They came to him for advice. He knew all of them and their kids, and it was this very beautiful role that he played as, frankly, kind of the last of his kind corner druggist. It was a very, very special thing. So they were doing well, and my dad was able to buy a little house. And then when my oldest brother was ready to start high school, and things in Detroit, sadly, were starting to decline a little bit. And by the way, the suburbs that we lived in were white suburbs, because there were, and this just has to be acknowledged, there were covenants that prevented black families from even buying land or a house in these suburbs, and the banks practiced redlining. They wouldn't give them mortgages. So there is a sad racist component to the story of the suburbs, and Detroit and other industrial cities is just a fact of what it was. So my dad was able to do well in the house, and so at that point he didn't want my oldest brother in the Detroit school, so they hopped 8 Mile Road. My cousin Joy is here, she's smiling, remembering this house. And this house, what a piece of architecture, huh? It was thrown up by some contractor who built it on spec, and we were the first owners of it. And so there wasn't really a lot of architecture going on in these suburban single-family house mass subdivisions. That's just what they were. And if you wanted to play some role in housing, well, architects were sort of doing the elite houses, right, for the wealthy. Or they were building apartment blocks, or they were doing public housing. And if you haven't heard of Pruitt-Igoe, I don't have a slide for it, but if you don't know the story, you should. It was a housing project that ended up being dynamited, but not because the architecture failed. Take the time to find out what that story is all about. So they were just, very standard houses, but in our neighborhood, all the lots were separately owned. So the houses were all different. And there were a couple that clearly there was an architect involved in this one, a little architectural thought. So there was a little bit of design going on, but for the most part, developers would buy up huge tracts of land and they would just throw up these masses of houses with a few variations, different bedrooms, different plans, but architecturally totally uniform. That's really the persona of single-family housing in the suburbs, and this massive sprawl as all these post-World War II families and the baby boomer generation decided on suburban living. So where were they going to shop? They weren't living in the city anymore. The cities had all kinds of opportunities that were walkable from these neighborhoods where they could shop, which brings us to Victor Gruen. He was an Austrian who fled the Nazis. He was an architect. And he came up with the notion of a regional shopping mall, Northland Center. Northland was a big deal for us. It's where everybody went for shopping. And the idea was essentially to create an urban setting. It was walkable, it was outdoors, it was landscaped. J.L. Hudson's was the centerpiece of this whole thing, but stores and restaurants, there was an auditorium. That Northland Center was really the heart of where everybody, I went with my mother all the time, and when I was a teenager, we used to ride our bikes there on Saturday and spend our time at Northland. Not Northland, Northland, right? And it was such a success, one of the first in the entire country. So of course they built Southland, Eastland, Westland. This was really the model for regional shopping malls. So here's how the suburbs work. You were totally car dependent. You had your house on your little piece of land and you drove to the mall or wherever you needed, and that was the lifestyle, and they were completely happy with it because it's what they felt they had fought for and how they won the war, to have the freedom and the right to live in this way. That was their choice for how to live. We were a Jewish family, and the Jewish community in Southfield was very successful. Lots of pharmacists and doctors and lawyers and business people. And we were members of this congregation Charetzetic, so they were able to build, I'm sorry, I meant to look up the name of the architect, I forget who it was, but you probably recognize this. It's right off Northwestern Highway.
It was Yamasaki.
No, this was not. No, for sure it was not Yamasaki. Yamasaki did Bethel on Telegraph. You're mixing up Jewish shuls. But thanks, John.
All these years.
It was built in 1963 for $6 million. And they held a service, sort of an inaugural service, inside of the steel frame. So imagine just the steel structure of this thing. And we were inside, and I was 8 years old, and I remember being really impressed by this incredible structure and this amazing building. And I think that was sort of the beginning of my interest in architecture. So I am a child of the suburbs. I am a white, middle-class, Jewish, suburban kid. That's how I grew up here in Southfield. And I was a creative kid. I started playing guitar when I was 8 years old, started performing when I was 15. I went to Southfield High School. By the way, I went to school from the second grade through graduate school, with the exception of 1 year at Wayne, within 2 square miles. Literally, Southfield High, Lawrence Tech. So there was a radio station. There still is a radio station at Southfield High, an FM radio station. WSHJ FM Southfield. So I was a disc jockey during high school. And what's next? Oh, and of course, a photographer. I got heavily into photography, had a camera over my shoulder every day in high school. Yearbooks are full of my pictures. My dad cornered off a part of the basement so I could have a dark room. So this was my life at those times. I really put myself into these kind of creative pursuits because I was the third child and nobody really gave a damn what I thought about anything. So this is how I occupied myself as a kid. So why architecture? Well, I drew well, took a drafting class, did well in it. I was always good at math. After the Charlotte experience, I started noticing buildings and realizing, wow, that's like unique. Somebody really had an idea and created that. So I started becoming interested in architecture. And the prospect of being a musician was simply not on the list. The culture of the Jewish middle class at the time was you were going to have a profession. And being a musician was not even something I would even considering, because I just knew it was never going to fly with my parents. So what was it going to be? Architecture sounded good, and then I read The Fountainhead. Now, I am not a devotee of Ayn Rand and her batshit crazy politics and social ideas. That's not what this is about. This book is about an architect, Howard Roark, who was a brilliant modernist early when everything had to have classical detailing. And so it's a story of this heroic man who would not compromise his principles and who had to fight like hell to be recognized for the architectural ideas and engineering skills and everything that he had. That's what turned me on about this. Very idealistic kid, and The Fountainhead really lit me up about architecture. So my parents bought me a drafting table. I had one since I was 16. Drafting table. This is how we used to. A straight edge. We use these things called triangles. Pencils, ever heard of? That's right, we learned how to letter. I still write that way. It kind of gets in you. Right. So here I am in the summer of 1973. I had 1 year at Wayne. This is my girlfriend Rowena's prom picture in the summer of 1973, and there was a huge storm in Southfield that tore the area up. A neighbor hired some friends of mine and I to clear his property of broken branches, and there was this tree in the front yard that he wanted to cut down. You know, he offered 18-year-olds money. So, yeah, sure, we'll cut down the tree. I was over 6 feet tall. I wanted to win the approval of my friends, thought I could do anything. So I climbed 20 feet into that tree to cut off this branch, and the tree sprung, and I fell and broke my back and became injured in my spinal cord. So I spent 6 weeks in Providence Hospital. Oh, I had such a terrible time there. Actually, it was a huge party. People were coming and visiting me in droves and bringing me stuff. I mean, it was really incredible. And so you see that metal frame up there. I had to lay straight while the surgery healed. I couldn't sit up or turn or anything. And so this was a circle bed. It was this circle of chrome steel. And it was used to alternate me from my back to my stomach so I wouldn't get pressure sores. And we did this every 4 hours, day and night, for 6 weeks. Which when they told me, I thought, are you kidding me? That's insane. But of course I couldn't say, you know what, no thanks, I think I'll be good. No, you just had to do it. So my disability experience from the beginning was one where I discovered the capacity that we all have. Not just me, but we all are built with a capacity to adapt. And also we are so easy to project ahead that we think somebody's going to be so terrible until we find out what it really is and how we're able to adjust to it. And that's what this experience has been about. So 6 weeks in Providence Hospital until I was transferred to the Detroit Rehabilitation Institute for 7 weeks, where they worked me like a pack horse, lifting weights, learning how to transfer my body in and out of the chair, wheelchair skills. I can still do wheelies. Thank you. How to take care of my body in a particular way, opening doors, loading my wheelchair into and out of a car. In other words, they taught me, they trained me how to live as a wheelchair user. It's a skill set. It's a matter of method. It's not a real mystical, mysterious thing. It's just about how it's done. And that's what I did in rehab. So here I am, a few weeks after. By the way, I also worked for a local photographer. I was at bar mitzvahs and weddings every weekend, holding the lights, loading cameras, worked in the studio, in the darkroom, so I asked him if I could come back in. So here I am in my first wheelchair, the classic folding aluminum Everest and Jennings chair. Now, during this time, my dad was going through some changes. My dad, hands on the circle bed. He had been forced to sell the drugstore on 6 Mile Road because the neighborhood was declining. We'd been broken into. It was losing value. He had to get out. There was just no choice. And he lost all the stability of those years and the emotional identity of how those people valued him. And a few days before I got out of rehab, my dad passed away. So I came home to not having a father, just me and my mom. And they were planning on moving to a condo that was going to be accessible for me. But instead, I had to spend the first couple of years still living in that house, dragging my butt up a flight of stairs to the upstairs where the only bathroom was that I could get into and my bedroom. And that's why they had to make me so strong I could transfer off the floor into a wheelchair. I only missed one term of school at Lawrence. So I show up on campus, and this building was not here. It was only the other original architecture building, and maybe you've noticed, it's half leveled up and half leveled down. I could not get into the building myself. The only way was to sit and wait for people to come along and drag me up and down the stairs. But not going to architectural school was not an option. I wasn't not going to do it just because of the inconvenience. So, and everybody kind of got the drill. And after a while, you know, you're going through the program with the same kind of people. So John, Mark, I don't know if anybody else is around from those days, but everybody had their turn dragging me up and down the stairs. And that's how it was done. But I wasn't okay with it. So I started to advocate. I wrote in the school paper. I wrote a paper for Dr. Buell, the chairman of the board, had a meeting with him, and he said to me, "Are you planning on finishing the program?" He wasn't getting it. It wasn't about me. It was about understanding that here's a category of people that you need to make your school available to. It's not for me, it's for everybody else. But the thinking about disability at the time was very, very limited. So it took me a while to convince them that they should make the building accessible, and then it took a long time to figure out what the design was going to be, where the money was going to come from, who was going to build it, get the permits, the whole process. It took 5 years to get the ramp. So you know the ramp out in front of the building out there? That's because of me. Thank you for your applause. Never mind. If you have to ask for it, you know, it's not the same. Did another, we did a cartoon in the school paper. I don't remember the guy's name who did this, but as part of the campaign, it was like, flying down the stairs, oops. And local Channel 7 News did a story about it. So this is one of the ways I evolved while I was here at Lawrence. I developed these advocacy skills, my writing skills, my comfort in interacting with people in positions of authority, my becoming really visible. Everybody on campus knew me, not just because I was the guy in the wheelchair, but they knew about this, and they knew what I was doing. And so we did another cartoon as I graduated with my 4-year degree. Oh, by the way, I do have a picture of it, as if you don't know what it looks like. There it is, my ramp at Lawrence Tech. Okay. What was I about to say? So since I was so visible, I decided to run for the senior representative for, then we were known as the student chapter of the AIA. And in that first year, I ran this series called Informal Discussions with Local Professionals. My mouth gets dry when I speak. That's why I need the spray. And I was kind of the Oprah of Lawrence Tech. And it's now an enclosed space, but it was an open foyer with an entrance back into the design studio. So I invited architects onto campus and sat out there and interviewed them, and people gathered around. And so I did this series of programs. And then I was president of the student chapter. Now, I was an architecture student, so I figure I might as well show you a little bit of the work that I did. I actually did do architecture while I was here. This was a student union building for a college campus that we were asked to design. This is a library and student complex which was designed for what was a large grassy area in front of the architecture building. And this is my Design 7 project. Now you know what that thing on the right is. Design a skyscraper. Now, in hindsight, I've got to be honest. I was kind of clueless about architecture, about what it really was, and about what it would really mean to actually be an architect in a practice as a business and all of the components of what it takes to actually create buildings. I was turned on by form. I loved geometry. I loved graphics. I was good at drawing. So those skills were becoming apparent to me, but the process of, how am I actually going to be an architect? I was honestly immature and naive, wasn't really clear about it. I wish that I'd done what Mark told me he did, where you took a couple of years off, you got a job in an office somewhere, and then you came back. Okay. But I was a B architecture student. I managed to fool everybody into thinking that I was going to be an architect. My mother and I had moved into an apartment while I waited for Lawrence to build their first student housing building. Is this the South Campus building? Yeah, right. Well, it was the only student housing at the time, and state law required them to have an accessible unit. So I had an accessible apartment, and this was when I lived on my own. And since they had put up the ramp and they built the building, I figured, I might as well stick around and do the graduate degree. But it took 2 years to do it because I was so involved in the student AIA stuff and in the national AIA stuff. So I did it over the course of 2 years. Now, I was hearing people complain about things. And I would say, well, why don't we do something? They're not going to do anything about it. It won't matter. So I got this idea to form a student caucus. And we held meetings in the auditorium with all the students, and we wouldn't let any faculty, we wouldn't let Dean Greimel in. He was really not happy about that. And we organized a series of statements, and then I booked the auditorium and I set a date, and we invited Dr. Buell, very conservative chairman of the board of the university, Dr. Marburger, Dean Greimel at the time, to come and sit with us so we could read these statements and have a conversation about these issues, things like access to the design studios during the last couple weeks of the term because people needed to do all-nighters. We wanted an internship program in local architectural offices. We wanted the program to be more integrated. It was so a la carte. We took design studios, we took structures, we took construction, we took electrical systems and lighting, we took acoustics, but nobody was ever putting it together for us. And we really were aware that we wanted to know how all this stuff fit. So here I am leading this student caucus meeting. And I think it brought about some change, but the moment I'll never forget, because this was an engineering school originally, right? The architectural school was sort of like, we were the weird ones on campus. And at some point, Dr. Buell said, and I don't remember the exact topic, but something to the effect of, what, you mean architecture students are whatever as engineering students? And the place just went nuts. Everybody started screaming and cheering and stomping their feet. So just that moment alone was incredibly cool and satisfying. So in my last year while doing my thesis, I was hired by Ross and Newman Associates. You guys might recognize this building across the freeway. They also did Pine Knob Music Theater and so on. I did drafting, I did some architectural illustration, but there was a recession on, which is tough on architectural programs, and in all honesty, I didn't have the skill set that they really needed. So after 6 months, I was let go from Ross and Newman. But I did finish my degree. There it is, Bachelor of Architecture from Lawrence Institute of Technology. Another thing that I had discovered while I was here is that I didn't want to live in the suburbs anymore. The suburbs were bland, had no architectural identity, were not diverse, totally dependent on the car. I drove very early on after my injury. So I wanted to live in the city. So I moved downtown. Oops, I got a blank slide first. There we go. So I moved down to the Wayne State campus. This is the Bellcrest on Cass. Fortunately, they had a bathroom that was workable for me. I had the Detroit Institute of Arts outside my window, fantastic film program, cafes, music. I performed in the Bellcrest down in the restaurant and bar down there. And I had landed a job with Johnson Johnson and Roy, an urban design firm in the Renaissance Center. And General Motors had bought a whole neighborhood of buildings just north of the Fisher Building and were doing renovations and hired JJR to do this project. And so I was sent out to inspect the exteriors, took pictures, looked for cracks and things that were off kilter and mortar coming out of the bricks and so on. And then I would go back to the office and I would do a drawing of the building and then start calling out all the different things. That's what I did. I also did a lot of graphics and graphic design for them. But the same thing happened that happened at Ross and Newman. In the end, I didn't have the level and array of skill set that they wanted, that I think they expected, but I just didn't have. So 6 months later, I was without a job. So in hindsight, I am very disappointed that I didn't get mentored. But at the time, that's not it just wasn't part of the culture of what people did. And it's amazing that nobody ever said to me, Gary, look at all these strengths that you have. You're a communicator, you love to draw, you've got a real sense of graphic design and geometry, you are able to lead programs, there are all these different things, and nobody ever said, here's the way we're going to help you find your place in the architecture profession. Nobody, not here at Lawrence, not at Rawson, not at JJR. I had no guidance for any of that. So I was basically out on the streets. But there are a lot of roles in the architecture profession. Design is actually a really small piece of it. You actually only get so much time that they can budget for it. The rest of it is, now you got to develop the construction documents, you got to deal with specifications and identifying materials, somebody's got to manage the project, somebody's got to deal with contract decisions about when the contractor actually gets paid, the architect makes that decision, right? Somebody's got to sell the practice. And you've got to know architecture in order to sell architectural ideas to potential clients. Somebody's got to run the business. You remember Sue Dement?
I do.
Yeah. I met Sue years later when she was living in Boston. That's what she did. She was a business manager for an architectural office. Graphic design, and of course, accessibility, which I didn't want anything to do with. Because my attitude in those early years after my injury was, what, just because I use a wheelchair, I have to do that? No, I want to be Howard Rourke. Actually, in the first week or two, Carl Greimel, the Dean of Architecture, he assembled all the students in the auditorium, and I heard him say, most of you are not going to be architects. I'm going to be Howard Rourke, what are you talking about? But he also said, this is one of the best educations that you can get. And in hindsight, I absolutely agree with that. So I was not in a position mentally where I was willing to say, yeah, I'm going to specialize in accessibility. No, not at that point. Probably would have been a good idea, because now I'd be like the world expert on accessible design. But again, no guidance, no mentorship. So please identify somebody that you've got a good relationship professionally with to have these conversations about where your place is. One of the things that I think I could have done really well was work on major architectural signage programs like airports and so on. That would have been perfect for me. Graphics, design, information for people, some construction aspects, part of the overall art. That would have been a good place for me. But I never got the opportunity. So I'm without a job, and I'm scanning the want ads, and I used to go to the AIA conferences, and I had gotten a chance to get my hands on the first CAD system. And they did a demo, and then he let me come over and try it out. And it really made sense to me. I took to it. So I see this ad, graphic artist interested in computers. Hello, me. So I applied for this job, and I got hired by AV Computer Graphics at Telegraph and 13. So I ended up commuting from Wayne State out, but it was perfect because the traffic was always going the opposite direction. I was just waving at everybody all backed up. This was a presentation graphics production business that was started by a family that owned a photo lab, and they mortgaged their house and put all their money into this Genegraphics 100B workstation. It did 64 colors. At the time, this was really astounding. Gradient backgrounds. The workstation only cost $250,000. The film recorder, another $250,000. I got trained in 2 weeks on this, and now here I am. I'm a production artist in the presentation graphics industry. And the Genegraphics got picked up nationwide, just exploded, because compared to what business people had access to before to give their presentations, these slides were so beautiful. We could crank out so many of them so fast that it became this massive industry. And in case you don't know what a slide is, it was a piece of film that was mounted in a paper or a plastic thing, and then they used this thing called a projector with a slide tray, and this was how business presentations were done. And so I had an 11-year career in the presentation graphics industry as a production artist and as a production manager. So here's another way that I evolved in these processes of all the details and all the steps of what needed to be done to track this work, to make sure the deadlines were being met, that everything was getting done. Well, the owner of the company, let's just say, was not easy. And he didn't care about design. Just give him the blue background with the yellow titles, like the usual stuff. So after a couple of years, I really needed to move on. So I left, and then word got out that an experienced Genegraphics production artist was on the streets. It was incredible. I was getting calls from all over the country, and I got called by a company in San Francisco called Chartmasters. They invited me out to freelance for 2 weeks. And they were in the process of opening a new facility in the Silicon Valley because the computer industry was really starting to boom in 1984, and they set up a state-of-the-art, spanking, brand new production office. And they offered me manager of computer graphics. So, California, here I come. But I didn't want to live in the suburbs. And I don't know if you've ever been out there, but Santa Clara, where the office was, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, these are classic suburban sprawl and regional shopping mall kinds of areas. And I did not want to be there. So I went on a scouting expedition, and I found Palo Alto, which had University Avenue. This is obviously not the whole street, but a walkable district with restaurants and shops and the Varsity Theater. This is a later picture of it, but it was a repertory theater that had food and drink, and I used to perform in that courtyard there, and I found an apartment a few blocks away. So I had, once again, that sort of urban experience of a walkable space that I was not entirely car dependent, that I had access to a place like this. All right. So here I am with the team at Chartmasters Santa Clara. There I am down in the corner. A very creative group of people, a company committed to good design. We designed formats for every client, beautiful work, full-time proofreader, production coordinators, photography. I mean, wow, these people were just committed to the best. So it was super to be part of this. But then, no thanks to some bad management decisions and competition that was undercutting our prices. It took a few years, but the office got closed down. It was heartbreaking. We had started this place from scratch. We were so proud of it. It ran so well. And so they moved us back up to the city. And so now I'm commuting to San Francisco from Palo Alto, and then the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake happened. So I moved to San Francisco. Now, yay, now I'm living in the city again. Way to go. That's what I always wanted. Then in the late 80s, the IBM PC and the Macintosh had evolved. And our clients started asking our salespeople, hey, I've got this software that says that I can make slides with it. Can you make slides for me from this software on my IBM PC? So the owner of the company took me out of that manager position. We did an in-house startup. We bought a system to do film recording from desktop software. People could modem. You guys know what a modem is? They could phone in their files, and we set up one of the first desktop services groups in the United States. And it was doing really, really well. And now I've got a Macintosh on my desk. Wow. With a mouse and a graphical interface. And there was a lot of stress in the business. There was stress with the boss. And I was working on this application from a database to create this sales tool. And I started feeling some pain in my wrists and then in my elbows. And it wasn't stopping. And I rely on my arms for my independence. And it freaked me out. So I went on disability. Didn't work for a year. Did everything I could to try to recover. And after about a year, I was ready to kind of get back to it. But I had to decide, what am I going to do now? Okay, I've got this skill set. I'm a graphic designer. I know presentations. I was a trainer. I was savvy enough in business from working in this industry, with interacting with clients. And I was learning about how to work safely at computers. I was learning about ergonomics. So that's when I set up my consulting practice. I went into companies, I did a training, and then I went around with everybody at their workstations to teach them how to arrange it and use it and adjust their chair so that they would be safe, because I had to leave a graphic design career because of my tendinitis. It's really serious. And I did it for a number of years, up to the point where architectural firms started using CAD technology. No more drafting tables. And I got a firsthand, didn't realize I'd pushed the button already. I got a firsthand look at how architecture practice works. Hello, there you are. And so I'm here to tell you that practicing architecture can be really dangerous depending on the job. There were some people who were assigned a facade or a certain space or something, and then just spend all day doing variations on it. So they're sitting at their computers, click, 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 save to the network, open the next one, click, 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 all day long, trashing their wrists and their elbows and their forearms because they didn't understand how to work safely. I'm not saying that the job is necessarily dangerous, but if you do it without understanding ergonomics, then you are at real risk. So a couple very quick principles about ergonomics. The body is made for movement, not for fixed postures. That's why we didn't get injured doing drafting. You're drawing here, you're drawing up there, you're taking a triangle, you're moving the straight edge around, you got your eraser shield, and you're moving. Nobody ever got injured doing drafting. We are not meant to do small, repetitive movements over a long period of time. That injures tissues. It's gradual, though. And that's what's so dangerous about it. You don't feel it until later, and then all of a sudden, now you have a chronic injury. And if you have a focused single task that's all you do all day long, that's another thing that makes it more dangerous. So please take the time to learn about ergonomics. And one of the things I recommend is using a pen pad. Because now your hand and your arm are able to move. You can work with it over on the side. Then you can recline back in your chair and put it on your lap. So now you've got some movement, you've got some variety. It's not a repetitive thing. So again, please do not risk. It can be career killing, this kind of stuff. Now, I'm not down on computers. I mean, look at what's made possible. Frank Gehry never could have built Bilbao without using computers to design this stuff, right? Or Zaha Hadid's firm out of Atlanta. Oh, I skipped. I had another picture. Okay. So wow, what computing has made possible in architecture is really cool, very exciting. And now robotics are starting to evolve for actually doing things to be able to build buildings in unique ways that would not have been possible in the past, and getting into 3D printing. So computing has really enlarged possibilities in the whole realm of architecture. It's exciting, very cool stuff that's happening. So, I was writing online about ergonomics. And I get an email out of the blue from somebody who was an editor, and she says, you know, I like the way you write. Why don't you come in here and meet us? And I was living in Northern California. They were in Petaluma, not far from where I was. They had no idea who I was, no idea I used a wheelchair. And I find out that they are planning a series of consumer-targeted medical books that they wanted written by people who had personal experience with it. A year later, I had a book contract. I'm an author. Who knew? My first book, Life on Wheels, it's a guidebook for wheelchair users. It's a very comprehensive, this is how it's done, lots of personal quotes throughout it. Second book, Disability and Art of Kissing, an exploration of intimacy through the lens of disability. And There to Here is a collection of 45 essays by people with spinal cord injuries who described their actual process of adjustment. Not just, oh, I hang glide and I climb mountains, all these kinds of things. No, how did that really happen? And I wrote for New Mobility magazine, articles and profiles and essays, and used my voice on the radio, performer as a guitar player, was used to being in front of people, so of course I'm going to get out there, and I've had a long career since 1999 as a professional speaker and a trainer at, as Mark said, universities, corporate clients, government clients, and so on. Now, little did I know, when I landed at Lawrence, that there was a major disability movement underway that began in the 1960s with this guy, Ed Roberts. When he graduated high school, he was quadriplegic from post-polio. And he applied to UC Berkeley, and they turned him down. And the California Department of Voc Rehab said, why would we pay your tuition? You'll never work. So he sued them. He won. He got into Berkeley in the 60s while the Vietnam War protests and militancy and organizing was all going on. He opened the way for more students with disabilities. They formed a group that started providing services to students with disabilities. Personal assistance, transportation, housing, note-taking, moving a class to an accessible location. And now, thanks to Ed Roberts, now there are disability student services offices in every college and university in the United States, including LTU. Who knew? Nothing of the sort when I was here, obviously, right? Okay. And then they established the first Center for Independent Living, not a residential facility, but an advocacy and services organization to optimize independent living in the community. I live in Phoenix now. This is the Ability 360 Center. This was funded and built, the fundraising, by people with disabilities. We're talking about a very sophisticated movement and community of people who said, we're done being denied the potential in our lives. My little advocacy experience here, this on a much larger scale. And here, the Ability 360 achieving a not bad piece of architecture for their offices and also other disability organizations all collected in one place. And on the same property, they built a full-scale athletic facility, completely accessible from scratch, only 2 of its kind in the United States. People with disabilities did this. Those people that, oh, they're disabled, we have to take care of them. And, oh, how sad. Get out of our way, we're getting on with it. There is a film called Crip Camp. If you have not seen this, it's on Netflix. It was nominated for an Oscar, and it tells a lot of the story of this disability movement that I'm talking about. And then the ADA was passed in 1990. Here's George H.W. Bush signing it. The reason that I had to be carried up and down stairs was because there was no law that applied to Lawrence Tech requiring it to be accessible. There was a federal law in 1960 only for federal buildings. Then in the mid-70s, the federal government and its contractors, but nothing that applied to a private institution. It wasn't until Title III of the ADA in 1990 that Lawrence was required to make his build. When was this building put up? 2000. There you go. 10 years after the ADA. Okay. And again, people with disabilities made this happen. So there is a large segment of the human family who have been emerging into society thanks to all of this stuff. They're healthier because they're more active. Medical advances, saving more lives, people surviving with disabilities. The difference between this wheelchair, which is completely custom built and ultra lightweight compared to that first one, I could talk for hours just about the chair. So increased mobility and power mobility, so people are much more active. Accessibility, I am rarely carried upstairs unless I'm visiting someone's house. It's the only time these days that I'm still carried up steps, okay? Now, access to education, as we've seen, and if they have access to higher education, that means they're thinking in terms of employment and career, and technology has changed the world so that work is less about physical labor. The information economy means that people with disabilities now are capable of working on a scale that wasn't possible in the past. They have achieved amazing advocacy accomplishments and still are. And these laws are civil rights laws. These are not like, oh, let's do this because we want to console the disabled people. And no, real people just wanting a level field so they can get out and live their lives. All of these objective changes have led to a real emergence of people with disabilities in society. Okay, so we have all these accessibility laws. But architects and the construction industry and building owners weren't really very happy about this in the beginning. How are we supposed to know how to build this stuff? And what's going to happen when the inspectors come to decide whether or not to give us an occupancy permit? And they're going to tell us to rip stuff out and rebuild it, and they're going to delay our clients being able to start their income flow for our buildings. Like, oh, this is a mess. We have no idea how to do this. And in the beginning, they sure didn't know how to do this. This is somebody's idea of a ramp. And this is not an accessible restroom stall. Because if I go in there in my wheelchair, how am I supposed to reach back and close the door? And I need to be at an angle to the toilet, not sitting in front of it to be able to get on it. So we needed standards. Bathrooms need a 5-foot turning radius for a wheelchair user, and where the grab bar is, and all the details of how it should be properly designed. Here's the good news. In 1970, oh, I'm sorry. I also want to throw in that now everybody loves big bathrooms. And we're seeing all this advertising for roll-in showers. Of course, it's because the baby boomers, we're all old now, so they're marketing this stuff to us, right? Okay. But all of a sudden, accessibility is hip. Okay. In 1973, the federal government established the U.S. Access Board. U.S. Access Board. Write it down, take a picture, everybody go to this website because it has all of the detailed illustrations for every accessibility aspect of any building that you can think of. Public spaces, train stations, you name it. It is all there. So there is now no excuse for resisting accessibility in design because you don't have to worry about the permits, you don't have to worry about how do I do this. It's all been worked out. Unfortunately, nothing in the ADA applies to single-family housing. Zero. The Home Builders Association had too strong of a lobby, and they said, no, you're not putting us in that law. And multifamily housing has a very small amount of requirements under the ADA. So when I'm out looking for housing, I've got this much to choose from. Looking for housing is when I have felt the most discriminated against of any other aspect of my disability experience. Housing is still a huge problem. They're still building stuff with steps, two-story townhouses, which brings us to the concept of visitability. A woman named Eleanor Smith in Atlanta, a power wheelchair user, she came up with this concept. A no-step entrance, wide enough doors and hallways for wheelchair passage, one usable bathroom on the ground floor. Just that. Not some huge long list of stuff you got to worry about. A lot of these visitable homes will be livable for many people with disabilities, but it's not just about where I live. It's also about my life in the community, being invited over for dinner, for parties, being able to drink all the beer I want so there's a bathroom that I could use. In the beginning, when I was first paralyzed and out in the public, I was unlikely to be able to find a bathroom that I could use. So that was a major thing that I had to constantly manage. The world was not at all friendly in the 70s. And there are actually some visitability ordinances in some cities and counties and some federally funded housing. So this is a concept that if you're involved in housing, you want to understand this. Now, important principle here. Complying with the law does not necessarily mean you're going to have a good design. They're two different things. And the most evil example that I'm going to share is these arena-style movie theaters. The only place that I can sit is that, I don't know, is it being burned out by the lights? You can see it here. This row here, the only place in the entire space where I can sit to watch a movie. And it's too close to the screen. And when I go with my friends, they don't want to sit there, so they sit up higher in the seats, and I end up sitting there alone. It's in compliance, it's legal, but it's a crummy design. So architects need to take the time to understand how people are actually going to function in the spaces that you design. So the curb cut effect. Isn't this great? I love this. The sidewalk's not even there, and they said, put the curb cut in anyway. I love it. What happened when they started cutting curbs? Did it help anybody else? Was it just for wheelchair users? How about that? Parents with strollers, delivery people, bicyclists, skateboard. Hey, how about that? You design well for disability, you get a better design, right? Things that you wouldn't have expected were going to be the case. It's going to turn out to be better overall. The concept is universal design, not barrier-free design, not disability or accessible design, universal design. The term was coined by a guy named Ron Mace. He was an architect who was post-polio, University of North Carolina. He coined the term. It is the best description of this. You include disability in your programming, you're gonna get a better design. That's the way it works. So, where am I at the story now? I was living in San Francisco. My mother passed away in 1996. I had some savings. She left me some money. I was in a position to buy. I wanted to stay in San Francisco. It took me a year and a half. I could not find a place that I could afford, that was accessible, and that was the plan for the way I wanted to live in the home that I was going to buy. So I was basically forced into the suburbs in Marin County. I know, it's horrible. And I moved up north. Hi, Sarah. Glad you're here. There was a guy, the only developer of suburban single-family housing in the United States, who hired an architectural firm. His name was Joseph Eichler. When he was a college student, he lived in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. They actually had to kick him out. He didn't want to leave it. So when he became a developer, he employed Wrightian principles, if you will, post and beam construction, floor-to-ceiling glass, very intimate relationship between inside and outside, slab foundation with radiant heat, which babies love to crawl around on. It's very warm, right? So I bought an Eichler in San Rafael, California. Now this wasn't my actual house. Somehow I couldn't find pictures, but this is the plan. This is what my backyard looked like. I had this version of the Eichler house. They also had, most of them had atriums in the middle, right? So I had to move to the suburbs, but at least I was living in a decent piece of architecture. And just like Palo Alto, here's 4th Street in San Rafael with all of those walkable urban qualities that I have always wanted nearby in the places that I live. What comes next? Oh, and coincidentally, I was across the freeway from this building that you might recognize, Frank Lloyd Wright's Marin County Civic Center. So I got married while I was living in that house. My wife and I were together for 10 years. And then the mortgage crisis and the recession happened, and the speaking and training business just dies when the economy goes down. So now I'm struggling, bringing in enough money, and my wife and I reached a point where we realized we were better going our own ways. So I got divorced right in the throes of this mortgage crisis and lost most of the equity in the house. We took a little money out of it, but not much. So I'm living in San Rafael, which is very expensive, and I'm trying to rebuild my business and having a hard time, and I had to leave. So I moved to Phoenix, which is more affordable. Had some other reasons why it was my choice. That's why I live in Phoenix now. And I wanted to introduce you to my neighborhood. I live in Roosevelt Row, which is just next to, it is downtown, but the convention center and the major hotels and high-rises and so on, I'm right up the street from all those. Roosevelt Row is an arts district. It's famous for its murals, and I live on Roosevelt Street. Here's Teddy Roosevelt, which is where I met Sarah and Carl Dobman for coffee when they were in town. Around the corner from there, this is my apartment building. Has some architectural quality to it, right? Has some thinking, some choices about color and surface and massing and a sense of identity. It doesn't look like everything else, right? So I've always tried to choose something that has some architectural identity and character to it. And you see, I got a cafe right next to me. A couple blocks up is the Nash. It's a jazz performance space where I volunteer. Another block up is the Phoenix Light Rail, which takes me to the airport, which takes me to Tempe, which takes me out to a medical center where I get some services. Down the street and out my apartment window is the Phoenix Main Library, not a bad piece of architecture. And a little farther down is the Phoenix Museum of Art. I'm not going to tell that story, I don't have time. And the first Friday of every month, they block off a huge stretch of Roosevelt Street and they throw a big party. Food, music, crafts, people watching galore. This is a 20s and 30s scene. This is a neighborhood where young people are moving in droves. By the way, Arizona State University built a downtown campus in the area. This was an area nobody would go into some time ago, and the city did a great job of rejuvenating it and bringing in all of these characteristics. And this is on top of my building. All right, where am I now? Unfortunately, Phoenix is building a lot of shitty architecture. They're putting up all these apartment towers that are just bland and no idea behind them. How the hell does this stuff happen? So remember the slide that how all the different roles that you can play in an architectural practice, there are other roles in the world which have an influence on whether good architecture comes into being in the world. Namely, city planners, urban designers. They have a big say in what's going to happen. Design review boards. We're not letting you build that piece of crap in our skyline. Are you kidding me? Nope, not in Phoenix. After you get your architecture degree at Lawrence, go get an MBA. Become a developer. Be the person who pulls together the money and finances buildings and builds good architecture. Developers of those other buildings, clearly, they don't care about good architecture. Every one of you does or will. right? Join a community nonprofit that are expressing their position about plans for what to build. Get involved in politics, because these decisions are made by political leaders and city council members. There are all of these other roles outside of an architectural office where you can have an influence on preventing the crime of what's going on in Phoenix now, right? Because that skyline should have a unique identity. Like, what do people think when they see a picture of the Detroit River and the Renaissance Center? That's Detroit, right? Buildings that are the identity and character of a place. Sadly, that's not what's going on in Phoenix. And they need people to make sure that good architecture happens in the world. Okay, so I saved my thesis for later. So here I am, I have become aware that I don't like the suburbs. I don't think single-family housing is a good solution in these mazes of streets. So for my thesis, I did this project where I did the math of a variety of different densities, and I wanted to create a community in a particular specific site in Dixboro, just east of Ann Arbor. And so I said, all right, I want to have every type of household. Older people, families with kids, married couples, unmarried couples, singles, roommates, and so on, and what kind of housing are they going to want to live in? They might choose, some of them will choose a high-rise, some will choose a townhouse, some will choose apartments, right? People make housing choices based on their lifestyle and how they want to live. And I wanted to have a mix of all these people, and so this was my design for my thesis. Instead of a maze of streets, just 2 loop roads, 2 high-rises, one of them at also a small shopping center, a community center next to it with athletic facilities and a place where people can hold events and teach classes and come together and have parties and so on. And lots of walking trails all throughout it, lots of sitting areas that were intended to bring people who lived in separate blocks would meet each other in these particular areas, barbecue grills, public art, so on. So this was my alternative to the single-family house subdivision, and also walking paths to be able to get to the village, to other neighborhoods, and so on. This site is now full of single-family houses, the typical subdivision. That's what they actually built there. But this was my notion. And this is one of the townhouse structures. Again, my love of geometry, my skill with drafting, and you see that middle unit, that's a 1-story unit. So every block had an accessible single-story unit. So that was my disability approach to this. Which brings us to the main theme and the closing topic here, urbanizing the suburbs. There are some major changes. So the baby boomer generation, those single-family home suburbs were perfect for them. Their children, like my friend Jay here, single-family house, raised a family, suburban house, worked perfectly for them. But the next generation is going to have very different choices. So let's look at some demographics here. Since 1970, predicted major drop of families with school-age children. And it's having children that really drives a lot of people to choose that single-family house in the suburbs. People are getting married later and having fewer, if any, children. Just the number of married couple households since 1970 to 2020 has dropped by 24%. What all of this means is that there's not going to be a market to buy the single-family housing stock that's sitting out there. The suburbs are facing a major change because of these changes in demographics, because as of 2010, there are now more millennials than there were baby boomers. And the millennials are making very, very different choices about how they want to live. And It's not going to be single-family homes for a lot of them. There are 87 million of them. So what I'm about to describe comes from this book. Take a picture of this. Everybody needs to read this. This is a description of all of this data, all of these trends, all of these new ideas about how the suburbs need to be essentially urbanized. So I'm not saying that, oh, wow, Gary, you were so ahead of your time because you wanted to live in urban kinds of places. No, that's the lifestyle, or, you know, and wow, look at your thesis, like how'd you... It's just what made sense to me, and it was just what choices I was making because of how I lived my life. So what millennials and what the data and the research is showing is they want walkable environments. They don't want to be dependent on the car. They are more socially conscious, so they're less inclined to be consumers of corporate product. They want to support local businesses, smaller businesses, very social, like the First Friday and all those brew pubs and all the beer and wine food in my neighborhood. People love to get together and party at a scale that really was much greater than in our generation. And they want it to be near a workplace where they want to be. So employers and builders of workplace settings are understanding all this. People are no longer willing, is this the next slide? Yes, to work in a sea of cubicles. Sorry, they're not going to choose that. They are going to choose employers who create more satisfying spaces that have recreation, that have walking trails, that have comfortable places for people to work, that have lots of places for people to get together and work in teams instead of everybody stuck in their cubicle, and once in a while you go into a conference room and you sit around a table. Now, they get that they need to do better design to attract this new generation of workers, mostly the millennials. And they're not going to be as dependent on the car because the autonomous vehicle is going to become very widespread. This is a shared autonomous vehicle, so if people want to get together, go somewhere, they're just going to order this up and they're going to go, and they'll leave the car home if they have one at all. In Phoenix, we already have, these are not experimental, we've got Waymo driverless cabs that people call up on their cell phones, and they are in business in Phoenix. You see them all over the place. So this also means less demand on parking, less land use that has to be paved over with concrete for parking lots. These are substantial changes that are coming up in the world, and it's exciting stuff. What's next? So, a quote from Suburban Remix. Fundamental long-term trends shaping demand for more urban lifestyles in cities and suburbs. So there are some very exciting projects that have been taking place. And this term mixed use is really the key to what's happening. Housing, retail, where you work, entertainment, people want that in one location, handy to where they live, if not living right in that mixed-use project, right? And they will move anywhere. We are much more of a mobile society. In my time growing up, you know, you actually had to spend a lot of money on a long-distance phone call. And it was a disincentive to moving away. You wanted to talk to your mom, it would have cost you $10 to make a phone call. And obviously, flying is so much easier and more affordable. We're so mobile, so people are going to go where they want to find these qualities of life, to find this lifestyle. They're not going to stay in a suburban area that is not making this investment in responding to these changes and doing urban mixed-use projects. Now, we've got one underway in Detroit, Northland Center. Very sad that it got shut down, and it's slow going down there, and whether it's going to have an impact on the suburbs because of where it is remains to be seen. But again, the key, mixed use. There's going to be housing, there's going to be retail, there's going to be entertainment, there's going to be business. That's the idea of what they're trying to do with Northland Center. So a few examples. Belmar, Colorado. They had a large enclosed shopping mall in Belmar, and then they were having trouble maintaining tenants. And so the city realized the mall's not working for us anymore. And the city council members, their kids were telling them, we don't want to live here, we're going to leave. So they tore down the mall and they built this mixed-use urban setting in their suburban city, Belmar, Colorado, right? Bridge Park in Dublin. Jack Nicklaus built a golf course in town, and it grew from 600 people in 1970, and then they put up office towers and office parks, which were state-of-the-art at the time. But then nearby cities started putting up more modern and current office parks, and they were drawing people away. So same thing. The Dublin city leaders realized, no, we got to change this. So again, this is not in the city, this is in the suburbs, and it has kept the town vibrant. Bellevue, Washington, another example. Walkable, obviously there's housing there. Arlington, Virginia is an interesting example because they got this like 30 years ago. They started planning for this kind of mixed-use living. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C., but it's very appealing because it has all of these characteristics of urban suburban, right? And last of all, Raleigh-Durham, where the Research Triangle is. I have been there. I was deployed with FEMA there for a while. This is a real happening part of town, and it's what that population of technology workers wanted. Look at any city master plan. This is from Livonia. There it is. Mixed-use development. Improve bicycle and pedestrian access. This is what's happening. And today, in the New York Times, there's an article about the role of architects, not just in suburbs, but in central cities too, right? This is a very exciting time for architecture. All of that technology that we were talking about before and just the possibilities in design, but now these transitions and these roles, architects are now going to be involved in middle-class housing. Remember I said that they didn't have much to do with the single-family houses and all these suburban sprawls, but now there's a role for architects to play in a new way, and unlike the city of Phoenix, your opportunity to have a role in bringing about good architecture in our communities and in our country. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
What a grand, sweeping talk about the role that architects play in our community, in our homes. I'm sort of stunned right now, but pleased to know you as a friend and as a former classmate. Gary Karp, I've really enjoyed today's talk. I hope
Thank you, Mark.
Everyone else here as well. If you all have any questions, feel free to come down and visit with Gary. I think he'd appreciate talking to you directly, but we'll say goodbye for now. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.